Welcome to Bloodlines Past, where wars become stories. The 7 Years' War had ended in 1763, and the world map of empires shifted like pieces on a chessboard. Britain came out as the winner, standing tall over North America as its new ruler. France, feeling beaten, had given up huge amounts of land. Its dreams of controlling the continent were crushed, but winning brought not just glory, it brought problems. Suddenly, Britain was in charge of thousands of French-speaking Catholic settlers in Canada. These people spoke a different language, followed different customs, and felt loyal to different rulers than the Protestant king who now claimed them. The British leaders wondered, will these Canadians stay peaceful, or will they rebel at the first chance? Many in London worried about rebellion. They saw Quebec as a land full of priests and farmers who were attached to their old ways and angry about being ruled by Protestants. The governors sent to Canada tried to walk a careful path. They offered religious freedom on one hand while keeping a watchful eye for any signs of disloyalty on the other. Suspicion hung in the air during every conversation between the settlers and the Crown officials. South of the Great Lakes, in the 13 Colonies, the memory of that war was still fresh. British soldiers had fought alongside colonial militias, winning at a huge cost. But after the war, the Crown wanted tighter control. They started taxing the colonies and keeping troops there to guard the new lands. To many Americans, it felt like they had traded one master for another, this time not France, but a bossy Britain. And so, when talk of liberty and fighting back began to spread in the 1770s, Canada became very important in revolutionary minds. If they could bring the French Canadians to their side, then Britain's northern defenses would fall apart. The dream was bold, a revolution not just of 13 colonies, but of a whole continent. Canada would not stay quiet on the sidelines. It was the key to Britain's defenses in North America, and perhaps the future of the revolution itself. But revolutions are never made by logic alone. They are made in the smoke of uncertainty, in the gamble of human ambition. As the fires of rebellion spread, American eyes turned northward with both hope and worry. Would the people of Quebec rise up with them, or stay silent behind their stone walls? This uncertainty would shape the very first attempt at spreading the revolution beyond its own borders. By the spring of 1775, the first shots of revolution had already been fired at Lexington and Concord. The colonies stood on the edge of open war with the British Empire. Yet in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress dreamed not only of defending their own land but of widening the fight. Their eyes turned north, across rivers, forests, and mountains, to Quebec. On May 29, 1775, Congress wrote a letter addressed to what they called the oppressed inhabitants of Canada. The message was grand, filled with the same ideals of liberty and natural rights that stirred Americans. Join with us, the letter begged, in the defense of our common freedom. The words were carried with great hope, as if ink alone could start a rebellion among French Canadians. But the letter was met with silence. The habitants, the French-speaking farmers who made up most of Canada's population, had lived under foreign rulers for a long time. France had abandoned them after the 7 Years' War, leaving them under the British Crown. And though they resented British officials, most Canadians feared what rebellion would bring. They were careful people, tied to the land, guided by priests who told them to stay loyal or at least stay neutral. To join a colonial uprising led by English-speaking Protestants was not an easy choice. There were divisions within Canadian society as well. Merchants in Montreal who made money through trade with Britain didn't want to risk everything for an uncertain cause. The Catholic clergy, who had huge influence, worried that siding with the Americans could threaten the religious protections recently granted by the Quebec Act of 1774. For them, rebellion might mean not freedom, but persecution, and so the appeal from Congress fell flat. The revolutionaries had hoped for a chorus of support. What they received was indifference, sometimes even suspicion. To many Canadians, this new American struggle was not their struggle. Their eyes remained on survival, not ideology. Yet, to the revolutionaries, Canada's silence was not the end of the story. Instead, it became fuel for bolder action. If persuasion failed, perhaps force would succeed. In the minds of men like Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, the revolution would not wait for Canadian hesitation. It would march northward and force destiny. When Congress's written appeals failed to stir the Canadians, the revolution gained new supporters who argued that words alone would never work. Among them stood two fiery figures, both experienced from the first sparks of war, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Allen was the leader of the Green Mountain Boys, a group of tough militiamen from the contested lands of Vermont. Rough, bold, and brash, Allen represented the spirit of frontier defiance. Only weeks earlier, he and his men had seized Fort Ticonderoga in a daring pre-dawn raid. The capture was bloodless, but it gave the revolutionaries precious cannons and supplies. Arnold, by contrast, was a man of restless ambition, intelligent, daring, and deeply sensitive to insults. He was already showing the traits that would later make him infamous. At Ticonderoga, he had clashed with Allen over command, each man convinced of his own right to lead. Yet, for all their rivalry, both agreed on one point. The revolution must not stop at the Hudson. Canada was ripe for the taking. They carried their arguments to the Continental Congress. Why not press the advantage while Britain is distracted? They asked. General Carleton had stripped Canada of regular troops to reinforce Boston. The French Canadians, they insisted, were waiting for a bold hand to free them. Strike now. Seize Montreal. Seize Quebec, and Britain's northern fortress would crumble. Congress hesitated at first. The revolution was still young, resources stretched thin, and the thought of extending war into another province seemed reckless. But the voices of Allen and Arnold proved persuasive. Perhaps their boldness was exactly what the moment required. On June 27, 1775, the decision was made. An army would march northward. Montreal would be the first target. Quebec, the prize that might open an entire nation to the cause of liberty. Thus, the stage was set, not by careful planning or overwhelming force, but by the conviction of two men who believed that destiny favored boldness. Their vision was contagious. Soon, men would be on the march, into forests, across rivers, through the unknown, convinced that they were about to bring revolution to Canada. While the Americans debated whether to strike north, the man in charge of defending Canada was already making mistakes that would shape the course of the campaign. General Guy Carleton, governor of Quebec, had served loyally under the Crown for years and was known for his calm temperament. But in 1775, his understanding of Canadian society and of his own strength proved dangerously wrong. Carleton was convinced that the French Canadians, though culturally different, would rally to Britain if called upon. He believed they valued order more than liberty, that priests and landlords would bring the habitants into loyal regiments with little persuasion. Confident in this belief, he sent 2 battalions of his regular garrison south to reinforce General Gage in Boston. Quebec, he reasoned, could be protected by its people. But the people were not so easily swayed. Many habitants wanted no part in foreign quarrels. They tilled their fields, tended their families, and eyed both rebels and redcoats with suspicion. To them, rebellion was an Englishman's war. Why risk everything for causes that belonged to distant rulers? When Carleton tried to raise new regiments among the Canadians, few volunteered. Promises of pay and duty were weighed against hunger, winter, and the disapproval of parish priests. The governor discovered too late that loyalty could not be created by decree. In Quebec City and Montreal, loyalty split along lines of class and commerce. British merchants dependent on imperial trade clung tightly to the crown. Catholic clergy urged obedience, wary that American victory might bring Protestant dominance. Yet ordinary Canadians remained cautious, neither eager to rise for Carleton nor for Congress. And so Carleton's gamble, sending away his professional soldiers while relying on local recruits, backfired. By the time he realized his mistake, the Continental Congress had already seen an opening. They sensed Canada was vulnerable, the defenses thin, the people hesitant. What Carleton dismissed as unlikely, the Americans saw as opportunity. The chessboard of empire was set. But on this northern frontier, it was not polished strategy that would decide the next moves. It would be improvisation, ambition, and the unforgiving realities of winter war. Into this gap of British uncertainty stepped the man chosen to lead the American invasion of Canada, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery, an Irish-born officer who had once worn the red coat himself. Montgomery had resigned from the British Army years earlier and cast his lot with the colonies. To his fellow revolutionaries, he seemed the perfect commander, experienced in European wars, disciplined yet sympathetic to the ideals of liberty. But ideals could not make an army larger. Congress entrusted him with just 1,700 men. Farmers and tradesmen, volunteers with little training, gathered under Montgomery's banner. Their muskets were worn, their uniforms mismatched, their spirits high, but their stomachs often empty. U.J. Wood, in his History of the War, would later remark that how Congress expected Montgomery to conquer a province with so few men is beyond me. Yet Montgomery did not shrink from the challenge. He carried himself with quiet dignity, a contrast to the fiery energy of men like Arnold. Where others barked commands, Montgomery inspired by calm resolve. He walked among his troops, sharing their hardships, offering steady words in place of fiery speeches. To many, he became less a distant general and more a father figure in the snowbound camps of the North. Still, beneath his composure, Montgomery knew the enormity of the task. He was to seize Montreal, then move east toward Quebec, the very heart of British power in North America. His army was too small, the distances too great, the supply lines too fragile. Winter loomed, and with it, hunger, frostbite, and disease. But revolutions rarely afford the luxury of perfect conditions. For Montgomery, hesitation meant failure. He accepted the assignment not because it was easy, but because no one else could or would, and so in the late summer of 1775, the quiet Irishman turned revolutionary general began his march northward, carrying with him the hopes of a Congress that expected miracles from mortal men. Montgomery's column moved northward along the waterways, their path threading through the dense forests and chill waters of Lake Champlain. Summer gave way to autumn, and with each passing week the march slowed, bogged down by supply shortages, sickness, and the unforgiving Canadian wilderness. What looked simple on maps in Philadelphia proved a brutal trial in reality. At the heart of the march stood Fort St. John's, a strong British outpost guarding the Richelieu River. It was here, on September 16, 1775, that Montgomery's expedition was stopped. Within its walls stood some 725 British regulars and Loyalist volunteers, commanded with determination and supplied by the surrounding countryside. The fort was no minor obstacle. It was a gatekeeper blocking the way to Montreal. The Americans lacked artillery heavy enough to batter the walls quickly. Siegecraft, not open battle, would decide the outcome. So the army dug in, raising batteries, cutting supply lines, and waiting for weakness. But this was no European siege with professional engineers. Montgomery's men were volunteers unused to the patience and precision demanded by such work. Trenches flooded with autumn rains. Morale sagged as days stretched into weeks. Food grew scarce. Disease whispered through the camps. Yet Montgomery remained steady. He kept the pressure constant, probing the defenses, tightening the noose. The Canadians in the countryside watched from a distance, neither rushing to support the British nor to aid the Americans. Their silence was its own kind of power, leaving both armies uncertain of what aid or betrayal might come from the villages and farms beyond. Finally, on November 2nd, the garrison at St. John's could hold no longer. After a siege of nearly 7 weeks, its defenders surrendered. The American flag rose over the fort, and with its fall, the road to Montreal lay open. It was a victory, but a costly one in time and spirit. The campaign had already drained Montgomery's small army. Winter was approaching fast. Still, Montreal beckoned, and Congress expected momentum. Montgomery pressed onward, his men trudging behind him, tired, hungry, but now carrying the weight of triumph on their shoulders. With Fort St. John's fallen, Nothing stood between Montgomery and the city of Montreal. The British defenses had been stripped bare, and Governor Guy Carleton found himself with only a fragile garrison and dwindling support. Montgomery moved swiftly, advancing with the momentum of victory, determined to strike before winter closed its grip. By November 13th, his forces had surrounded the city, landing troops north of Montreal to seal the approaches. It was not the thunder of cannon, but the quiet weight of inevitability that pressed down on the defenders. Carleton knew the truth. Montreal could not be held. Supplies were thin, walls too weak, morale uncertain. To resist meant destruction. To yield meant survival, and so, in the tense hours before Montgomery entered the city, Carleton made his escape. Disguised and aided by Loyalists, he slipped onto a small boat and drifted across the St. Lawrence River under the cover of darkness. He narrowly avoided capture, evading American patrols by mere minutes. His survival meant that Quebec, further downriver, still had its commander, a fact that would prove decisive in the months to come. When Montgomery's troops marched into Montreal, they found a city subdued rather than defiant. Merchants kept their shutters drawn. Priests prayed for peace, and ordinary Canadians watched silently as the newcomers filed through their streets. There was no joyful uprising, no flood of allies rushing to join the cause. The people were weary, cautious, uncertain of whether these Americans were liberators or conquerors. Still, for Montgomery, it was a triumph. With little bloodshed, he had secured one of the key cities of Canada. Congress hailed the victory as proof that the Revolution could spread beyond the 13 colonies. Yet, beneath the surface, doubts lingered. Montreal had fallen easily, but Quebec, with its stone walls and stronger garrison, would not. For now, though, the path eastward lay open. Montgomery gathered his men and prepared to march toward Quebec City, where another army, led by the restless Benedict Arnold, was already struggling through the wilderness to meet him. The fate of the northern campaign would soon hinge on their rendezvous. While Montgomery secured Montreal, another force was fighting its way north through a very different path, one that tested the limits of endurance. Colonel Benedict Arnold, restless for glory, had been sent by George Washington himself to carve a trail through the Maine wilderness and strike Quebec from the east. Arnold set out in September 1775 with 100 men, including riflemen from Virginia and hardy New Englanders. But almost from the beginning, the expedition was plagued by misfortune. The maps provided were terribly inaccurate, reducing rivers and mountains to misleading sketches. The bateaux, flat-bottomed boats meant to carry supplies upriver, were hastily built and leaky, soaking precious food and gunpowder. As the weeks dragged on, the wilderness closed around them. Torrential rains turned rivers into torrents and trails into swamps. Men waded waist-deep through icy water, dragging the waterlogged bateau by ropes. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies left behind as grim markers of the march. Flour rotted in its barrels, meat spoiled. Soon hunger gnawed at the column. Soldiers boiled their leather shoes for food or chewed bark to quiet their stomachs. Disease followed hunger. Dysentery, fever, and malnutrition thinned their ranks. Spirits faltered. One by one, groups deserted, slipping back south to the safety of the colonies. By the time Arnold's column staggered into the outskirts of Quebec in early November, barely 600 remained, starved, ragged, many without shoes. They looked more like survivors of a disaster than the vanguard of an army. And yet, Arnold drove them onward. His ambition burned hotter than frostbite, his determination sharper than hunger. He promised his men that Quebec would fall, that they would find food, shelter, and victory inside its walls. To the Canadians who saw them arrive, the Americans appeared ghost-like, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but still carrying their muskets and banners. It was a march that would become legendary. Not for its triumph, but for its sheer endurance. Arnold had not conquered Quebec, but he had done something nearly as remarkable. He had brought his men through a wilderness that should have killed them all. Now, battered and starving, they awaited Montgomery, hoping that together they might accomplish what alone seemed impossible. On the frozen banks of the St. Lawrence, the two American expeditions finally came together. Montgomery, fresh from his victories in Montreal, marched eastward with supplies, cannons, and a disciplined, though weary, force. Arnold, by contrast, emerged from the wilderness like a shadow of a man. His troops were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and reduced to barely half their original number. When the ragged survivors of Arnold's march stumbled into Quebec on November 9th, the contrast was stark. Their clothes were tattered. Many had no boots. Their weapons were rusted from rain and swamp, yet their eyes still burned with the fire of men who had refused to die. Only days later, on December 2nd, Montgomery's men arrived, healthier, better fed, bringing with them food, munitions, and the sense of structure Arnold's starving column desperately needed. For a moment, it seemed destiny had aligned. Two armies coming from different directions had met before the walls of Quebec. Their commanders were opposites in temperament, Montgomery calm and measured, Arnold restless and impulsive. But together they represented the Revolution's hope of striking a decisive blow in the North. Inside the city, British Governor Guy Carleton had returned from his narrow escape at Montreal. Now entrenched within Quebec's thick stone walls, he commanded around 1,800 defenders, regulars, loyalist volunteers, and seamen from the Royal Navy. To them, the Americans outside the gates looked less like conquerors and more like desperate men on borrowed time. The local population watched with quiet unease. Some Canadians offered small tokens of support to the invaders: food, shelter, whispers of information, but most remained cautious, unwilling to gamble their safety on an uncertain revolution. In the marketplaces and churches, the question lingered: were these Americans liberators or a passing storm that would vanish with the thaw? Still, the symbolism was powerful. For the first time in history, American forces stood united at the gates of Quebec. If they could capture the city, perhaps Canada itself might join the revolution. The fate of the Northern campaign now rested on what happened next. As snow began to blanket the fields, and the calendar edged toward the year's darkest days. When Montgomery and Arnold finally joined before the walls of Quebec, they faced a grim reality. The city was no Montreal. It was no frontier fort like St. John's. Quebec was a citadel, a fortress of stone perched high above the St. Lawrence, with walls that had endured sieges before. To capture it with raw determination and a handful of battered cannons was a fantasy, but it was the only option left. On December 2nd, Montgomery's men brought desperately needed reinforcements, 300 fresh troops, food, ammunition, even captured British uniforms. They also dragged cannons through the frozen landscape and set them up facing Quebec's defenses. But when the first shots rang out, they thudded harmlessly against thick stone walls, leaving only shallow scars. The defenders jeered from the ramparts. The Americans tried digging trenches and raising earthworks, but the frozen ground defied them. Shovels clanged uselessly against ice. The bitter cold seeped into every tent, every bone. Men wrapped themselves in rags and prayed for dawn. Worse, still, the soldiers' enlistments would expire in just a matter of weeks. If victory did not come soon, the army itself would dissolve. Montgomery and Arnold conferred daily, weighing their dwindling options. They had no time for a proper siege. They had no heavy guns to batter walls. Their numbers were thinning by frostbite, disease, and desertion. Each day they stared up at Quebec's towers, and each day the city stared back, unbroken. Morale teetered. Some men muttered about going home, about surviving the winter rather than dying pointlessly in the snow. Yet others still dreamed of glory, of a sudden strike that might carry them over the walls and into history. The commanders knew the truth. Waiting meant certain failure. Action, no matter how desperate, was their only hope. And so, with the year drawing to a close and the storm clouds of January pressing near, Montgomery and Arnold made their decision. Quebec would not fall to siege. It would be taken by storm. As December deepened, the sense of urgency became unbearable. The enlistments of Montgomery's men would expire at the turn of the year. When the clock struck January, hundreds would simply walk away, their service done, their oaths fulfilled. Every soldier knew it, every officer felt it. The revolution itself seemed held hostage by the calendar. Montgomery and Arnold agreed that they could not wait. A direct assault on Quebec was the only path left. Plans were drawn with the precision of desperation. Diversionary attacks would distract the garrison while two main columns slipped into the city's weaker points. It was bold, perhaps reckless, but it offered the only chance before the army dissolved into the snow. On the night of December 27th, under cover of snowfall, the men assembled. Muskets were checked, bayonets fixed, prayers whispered. In the dim light, shadows stretched across the frozen ground. Soldiers tried to silence the pounding of their hearts as they prepared to throw themselves against the most formidable city in North America. But fate can turn on the smallest shift of wind, the briefest break in cloud. As the troops moved into position, the sky suddenly cleared. The moon cast its pale light across the snow, illuminating the American columns for all to see. The element of surprise, everything their plan relied upon, vanished in an instant. From the walls of Quebec, British sentries spotted the movement and sounded the alarm. Montgomery had no choice. He called the attack off. Frustration rippled through the ranks, mingled with relief from men who had expected death that night. Yet the reprieve was short-lived. Only 4 days remained before enlistments expired. Time was no longer slipping away. It was galloping. Then came a cruel twist. A sergeant deserted to the British, revealing Montgomery's plans to Carleton. Now the defenders knew exactly what was coming. The advantage of surprise was gone forever. Still, the American commanders refused to give up. Their cause, their reputations, their very army depended on one final throw of the dice. The decision was made. They would try again, not under a clear moon, but in the heart of a storm. The year was ending, and with it the fragile army outside Quebec. The men's enlistments would expire in a single day. Montgomery and Arnold knew this was their last chance, a final gamble before the Revolution's northern dream collapsed. Fate seemed to offer them an ally. A blizzard rolled in on the night of December 30th. The wind howled, snow whipped across the ground, and visibility dropped to near nothing. Where moonlight had betrayed them days before, the storm now promised concealment. At 2:00 in the morning, Montgomery gave the order. His column moved south along the frozen banks of the St. Lawrence, snow stinging their faces, cloaks pulled tight. Arnold's men, meanwhile, prepared to strike from the other side. The plan was simple in design but perilous in execution. 2 converging attacks through the city's narrow approaches while diversionary forces created chaos elsewhere. The soldiers pressed forward through the storm, their torches snuffed out, guided only by the voices of their officers and the muffled crunch of boots in snow. The air was heavy with dread and determination. Many knew they might not see daylight again, but the thought of returning home without striking a blow felt worse than death. Inside the city, Carleton's garrison sheltered from the storm, but they were alert. Thanks to the deserters' betrayal, they knew an assault was coming. They waited, muskets ready, cannons primed, eyes fixed on the blinding whiteness outside the walls. For Montgomery, the moment was charged with destiny. He led from the front as he always had, determined to inspire his men by his own example. Arnold, battered but unbroken from his wilderness march, limped through the drifts with equal resolve. 2 very different men, united by a single purpose, now hurled themselves into the teeth of the storm. The attack had begun. What followed would decide not only the fate of Quebec, but whether the Revolution itself could spread beyond the borders of the 13 Colonies, or die frozen in the snow. Montgomery led from the front, as he always had. With just 17 men, he pressed southward through the snow along the frozen banks of the St. Lawrence. His target was a small riverside redoubt, a position he believed weakly defended, perhaps even abandoned in the storm. In his mind, surprise was assured. The blizzard was cover, the night his ally. Victory lay just beyond the barricade, but Quebec's defenses were not hollow. The redoubt Montgomery charged was no empty post. It was one of Carleton's strongest points, bristling with cannons and manned by vigilant defenders. Hidden in the storm, the British waited, their muskets steady, their artillery loaded with grape-shot. Montgomery urged his men forward, his figure visible against the snow. He had gambled everything on momentum, his authority, his courage, the Revolution's hopes for Canada. Then, as his small band sprinted into the clearing, the redoubt erupted. Cannons thundered at near point-blank range. A storm of grape-shot tore through the air. Montgomery was struck instantly, killed where he stood. He fell without a word. His life ended in a flash of smoke and steel. Those who had followed him, stunned by the sudden slaughter, broke and fled into the blizzard. In the chaos, the general's body was left behind in the snow, lit by the brief glow of musket fire before darkness swallowed it again. News of his death spread quickly through the ranks. The quiet, steady commander, the man who had carried the Revolution into Canada, was gone. His soldiers, once emboldened by his presence, now staggered back in despair. For the Americans at Quebec, the campaign had lost not only a general, but its heart. In that moment, as snow buried the ground where he lay, the dream of conquering Canada seemed to die with him. On the opposite side of Quebec, Benedict Arnold pressed forward through the storm, unaware that Montgomery had already fallen. His men, though exhausted and half-starved, moved with grim determination, slipping past an artillery outpost near the palace gate under cover of the blizzard. For a moment, it seemed fortune smiled. Their column advanced undetected into the narrow streets of the city. But fortune is fickle. Musket fire cracked from hidden positions, and suddenly the storm was filled with sparks of powder and the cries of the wounded. In the chaos, Arnold refused to cower. He strode into the open, rallying his soldiers with defiance. He shouted orders above the wind, urging them forward, leading by reckless example. Then, in the midst of the charge, a musket ball ripped into his leg. The pain was searing, dropping him to the ground. For most men, it would have been the end, a retreat, a stretcher, the fight abandoned. But Arnold tried to rise, his face pale, his determination unbroken. His men dragged him to safety, blood staining the snow as he struggled to command even while injured. Leadership fell suddenly to Captain Daniel Morgan, a Virginia rifleman known for his ferocity in battle. Arnold, gritting his teeth, yielded reluctantly, carried from the front while the fight raged on without him. The streets of Quebec echoed with the clash of steel and the shouts of men fighting in blinding snow. Yet the image of Arnold, wounded, furious, refusing to surrender, burned itself into the memory of those who saw him. For all his flaws, for all the pride that would one day betray him, in that hour he embodied the Revolution's reckless courage, to charge forward even when the odds and fate itself conspired against him. With Arnold carried from the fight, command fell to Captain Daniel Morgan, a towering figure with a reputation for unshakable grit. Morgan had once been flogged brutally during his service in the British Army, a humiliation that left him with a lifelong hatred of the Crown. Now, in the streets of Quebec, he seized his chance for redemption. Rallying the battered column, Morgan led his men forward into the narrow lanes of the lower town. Musket balls whistled past, ricocheting from stone walls. Yet he pressed on with fearless resolve. His riflemen surged behind him, charging through barricades, and in the chaos, they captured a British captain and more than 100 soldiers. For a moment, it seemed the impossible was within reach. Quebec's lower town lay open, undefended, the road to victory stretching before them. But Morgan hesitated. Victory in sight, he stopped to consult his officers. They warned of overextension. Too many prisoners to guard, too few men to hold new ground. They argued that advancing further without Montgomery's column would be reckless. Morgan, brave but practical, agreed to wait. That pause, an hour of deliberation, proved fatal. While the Americans lingered, Carleton acted. He shifted his defenders, reinforcing barricades, cutting off escape routes, and encircling the rebels with ruthless precision. The advantage that Morgan's courage had won was squandered in the cold silence of indecision. When Morgan finally resolved to press forward, the opportunity had passed. British muskets opened fire from fresh positions. The streets that had seemed clear were suddenly death traps. What might have been a breakthrough collapsed into entrapment. Still, Morgan fought with the fury of a man who would not yield easily. He urged his soldiers on, his own face marked by a grazing bullet and his hat pierced clean through. Yet, even as he pushed forward, the walls of Quebec were closing in. The Revolution's best chance in Canada had come and gone, lost not in cowardice, but in a single hesitation that turned triumph into tragedy. By morning, the storm had quieted, but the echoes of musket fire still haunted the narrow streets of Quebec. Daniel Morgan and his men found themselves trapped in the lower town, surrounded by British regulars who had moved swiftly to block every path of retreat. The blizzard that had promised concealment now felt like a tomb, sealing them in with their enemy. At first, Morgan refused to yield. He pressed his soldiers to hold their positions, firing from doorways, alleys, and shattered barricades. But the British had the advantage of numbers, of walls, of discipline. From every direction came volleys of musket fire, the smoke mingling with the snow until it seemed the very air was choking them. One by one, American soldiers fell. The cobblestones were slick with ice and blood. Men dropped their muskets, clutching wounds, collapsing in drifts of snow that quickly buried their bodies. Still, Morgan fought, defiant to the last, his face streaked with powder and frost. But the truth became undeniable. They were surrounded, cut off, with no reinforcements coming. Montgomery was dead. Arnold was wounded. The northern expedition was broken. At 9, Morgan was forced to make the choice no soldier ever wants to make: surrender. He handed over his sword, his men laying down their arms one by one. 430 Americans became prisoners that day, marched away through the very streets they had tried to claim. The cost was staggering. 60 Americans killed, 34 wounded, hundreds captured. The British losses, just 5 killed and 13 wounded. The disparity told the story in numbers. What had been a gamble ended as a rout. As the prisoners were led away, the survivors who had escaped back to camp looked on in silence. The Revolution's northern gamble lay in ruins, its dream of a Canadian uprising buried beneath the snow of Quebec. The assault on Quebec had failed. But for Benedict Arnold, surrender was unthinkable. Even with Montgomery dead, Morgan captured, and hundreds lost, Arnold clung to the city's outskirts, determined to hold his ground. Through the bitter winter of 1776, he and the remnants of the American force entrenched themselves outside Quebec, their numbers dwindling, their spirits fraying. The camp was a place of misery. Snow buried the tents. Food was scarce and disease spread unchecked. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, their breath visible even inside the flimsy shelters. They spoke less of liberty and more of survival. Letters home carried words not of victory, but of hunger, sickness, and despair. Yet Arnold refused to abandon the siege. His leg still wounded, he directed what remained of his men with stubborn resolve. He sent pleas southward for reinforcements, insisting that Quebec could still be taken. His determination kept the army from disbanding entirely, but it also tethered them to a hopeless cause. When spring came, reality arrived with it. In May, British reinforcements landed, 4,000 fresh troops under General John Burgoyne. Their numbers dwarfed the ragged American survivors. Against such force, resistance was futile. On June 18th, the decision was made at last. The Americans withdrew from Canada, leaving behind their wounded, their hopes, and their dead. Arnold, ever unwilling to yield until the final moment, was the last to depart. He limped southward with the remnants of his army, their ragged flags lowered, their dream of a northern revolution extinguished. The invasion of Canada had begun with bold promises, with letters to oppressed inhabitants, with talk of liberty crossing borders. It ended in silence, retreat, and the bitter recognition that Canada would not join the American cause. The American invasion of Canada ended not with triumph, but with silence and snow. What had begun as a bold dream to spread liberty across borders, to unite colonists and Canadians in a common cause, collapsed in the face of reality. The Revolution would remain an American struggle, confined to 13 colonies, not a continental uprising. Why did the invasion fail? The answers are many. Congress had entrusted too few men with too great a task, expecting miracles from scant resources. The logistics were impossible. Marches through wilderness, rivers turned to ice, supply lines stretched to breaking. Disease and hunger proved as deadly as British muskets. And above all, the revolutionaries misjudged the Canadians themselves. Far from rushing to embrace liberty, most habitants chose neutrality, their priests urging caution, their merchants wary of rebellion. Without local support, the Americans were strangers in a frozen land. Yet failure does not erase courage. Montgomery's calm leadership, Arnold's reckless drive, Morgan's defiance, each left a mark on the Revolution's story. Their names became symbols. Montgomery mourned as a fallen hero, Arnold remembered for both valor and betrayal, Morgan destined for future victories elsewhere. In their determination, the spirit of the Revolution endured even as the campaign collapsed. There's also the haunting question of what if? If Quebec had fallen, could Canada have joined the rebellion? Could the Revolution have reshaped not just 13 colonies but the entire continent? Or would the Americans, stretched thin and exhausted, have lost everything in trying to hold it? History does not answer, and perhaps it never can. What remains is the lesson. Revolutions are not built on bold proclamations alone. They are forged in patience, in supply, in the hard truths of geography and loyalty. The Northern invasion revealed the limits of American power in 1775, but it also revealed the resilience of a cause that refused to die even in defeat. The dream of Canada was buried in the snow of Quebec, but the Revolution pressed on, finding new battlefields, new hopes, and eventually a new nation. The failed invasion was not its end, but a costly reminder that liberty, no matter how noble, must first learn where it can and cannot take root.